everybody, and welcome to the general meeting of the Martin County NAACP. Tonight we are so grateful to have a very special speaker here tonight, Ms. Lori Prim. She is going to be presenting a very, very hot topic tonight. She's going to talk to us about charter schools and the impact of charters, financially especially, on the public school system. So please give a warm welcome to Ms. Prim.
Woo! Thank you. And I want to say thanks so much to Jane and Mr. Smith for inviting me tonight to speak to everybody here about this really important topic. And I first just want to mention that I'm wearing orange tonight because normally today, this day of the year, I'm in Washington, D.C. with Resolve, the National Infertility Association Advocacy Day, and I couldn't go this year because of a family event I'm traveling for. So our color is orange, and I wore that tonight, and I just want to shout out to my infertility sisters and anybody who struggles to have a family or wants to have a family, needs help building it. We're all out here working for everybody for that, so thank you. I also just want to say briefly that tonight my talk is about education, but I want to ask everybody to sort of put on a different lens for this and realize that education and the attack on our education and public school system that we're experiencing right now is not really about education at all, much in the same way that abortion and what's going on that we're all seeing right now is not really about abortion or even pregnancy or reproductive rights. And voter suppression is not really about felonies or, having too much weed in the car if you get pulled over. And guns are not really about the Second Amendment. All of these issues, the underlying issue truly is control and power. Through all of these issues, these are the ways that we are controlled by people who are in power and want to stay in power. And it all comes through money and being able to control people. So education controls everybody, right? Because we all need to be educated. Abortion controls women. Voter suppression controls demographics and particularly people of color. Guns, what's more powerful than a gun? So that's all about power. And so everything that I talk about tonight really should be filtered through the lens of power and control and why education is such a big component of that actual plan. And in order to talk about all this, we really have to delve back a little bit into history. And I try not to get too far into the weeds with everything, but it really goes back so far that you can't even understand what's going on today without understanding where it started from. And it started way back in the 1800s when the majority of the wealth in our country was in the South. And that wealth came through mostly crops and mostly cotton crops, which was produced by slavery. Okay, so we have a very rigid hierarchy right from that time of wealthy property owners controlling everything. So that's as far back as the 1800s. And over time, when those people in power started to feel like some of their power was threatened by other groups, by emancipation, they were trying to find a way to fight back. And there was a man named James McGill Buchanan who basically was a libertarian, and for anybody who doesn't know, libertarians basically feel like they don't want any government control over anything. So he wanted government control to let go of everything so that people who were wealthy and owned property and were in control of everything didn't feel like they were having their rights infringed upon. They felt like the government was infringing upon their rights. So that's where the whole movement really started. And he did a lot to research that and work with various papers and groups and stuff, but he didn't really have enough oomph behind him, and by oomph I mean sort of charismatic appeal and also money. So he did what he could, but really it was when two other things happened. One, in 1954 was Brown versus the Board of Education. And what that was there was a collective group of lawsuits through NAACP lawyers that were fighting segregated schools. And those cases came together in the case called the Brown versus the Board of Education. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled through the Brown versus the Board that racial segregation of schools was unconstitutional, which is a wonderful thing. But the libertarians didn't think that was a wonderful thing. The wealthy people of the South didn't think that was a wonderful thing. And they really put up a huge fight after that, primarily in the state of Virginia, and to the point where they would have preferred, and they did prefer, closing down public schools to everybody, black and white students, rather than not having segregation anymore. So that is really where the privatization of education started, because as they were what they felt forced to integrate, they said, well, if we create a private school system where only the wealthy white families can afford to send their kids, we can get around this. So they literally padlocked all the schools in Virginia, and no one was in school for a while. And then, of course, white wealthy people created private schools that only they could afford to send their kids to, and people also kind of congregated in churches and other buildings and stuff to try to educate. But there was actually a time from 1959 to 1964 that there really was no black schooling because of this. And it pains me to even say that. But that's important history I think people should know. And from that time, these people, this group of wealthy people who wanted no government control and wanted to be at the top of the hierarchy, started pushing for the privatization of education. They framed it, and that's an important word, framing, because to this day we see them framing everything, meaning talking about how we message it to make it more palatable to everybody. They framed it as a public school monopoly. They said, well, public schools have a monopoly on everything, so we're just doing this, as another fair chance for everybody else. And they still, right now, the charters, the vouchers, all of that are using that term, monopoly. And this is also where vouchers literally began. So remember how early this is, in the 1950s. They created tax-subsidized private schools, which essentially is vouchers. And even now, we'll get into this after, but even now, they have vouchers to a private school, but the voucher is worth so little compared to the actual tuition. Who can afford to go? The rich people. So this group of people actually believed that it was an excess of democracy to educate so many people. And I'm getting all of this, really, most of it from, the main source is Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean. And she's a historian, and there's all kinds of resources, and sources are very important, so footnotes and documentation of where all this is from. But that just sort of gives you the basic history of how far back this went before anything that we hear now really registered. So that was in the 1950s, and things kind of played along with that. Again, I could get really more into it, but then what happened next, really, that kind of brought the next wave in, was basically, in two words, Charles Koch, K-O-C-H. And he is a libertarian who also feels like government should just be ripped out at the roots and have no control over anything. And he met with another libertarian who had founded a school to teach anti-government and property supremacist vision of liberty. So he kind of came in with all this, with this school teaching people this, how wonderful, and he is a bazillionaire, oil magnate, and all kinds of money. And so he joined this person who ran this school, and he hooked up with James Buchanan, and this whole like perfect storm of people with these ideas met the money to build a movement behind it. And Charles Koch literally dumped billions of dollars into his whole ideal of taking out the government, taking out people who think that anybody should be getting anything from the government. And the most basic way to do this is through schools, through education. He basically used this wealthy, property-owning, racist ideal to promote libertarianism. Now, I don't want to say he wasn't a racist too, because again, if you get into those weeds, he and his parents, I mean, that's a whole nother nightmare. But basically, he really is so into money and lack of government control that that's what he saw, and he used the schools to promote the libertarian agenda. So again, I feel like anytime we talk about our schools, I want people to kind of view it through this lens, even though it's really hard and it kind of like beats people over the head with so much. But I don't think you can really grasp what's going on right now without knowing that history. So fast forward to when Charles Koch comes in with all the money, and in the 1970s, kind of came about this. And his first major philanthropic thing was to dump money into schools to try to start promoting this privatization of schools. Get the government out, run schools through private companies, make profit. You're getting rid of government, you're segregating everything again. I mean, it was just like a dream for them. So at the same time, we have another wealthy family, the DeVosses, and Betsy DeVos right now is our Secretary of Education. And she and some other families too, the Mercers, the Waltons, that they really are out for the agenda of rich people need to rule everybody else. And I don't want to just like rag on rich people in general. That's not what this is about. There's lots of rich people who support government and public services and funding, and they support the ACLU, and they support public schools and clean water and just everything that we love and need as a community. This is a very minute number of people who really are doing this. And so Betsy DeVos has the second agenda of also privatizing things to promote a religious agenda. She's very religious herself, and she thinks that everything should be done to promote the kingdom of God. So they've hooked up kind of all these people and said, okay, how are we going to do this? And basically how they plan to do it and how they are doing it is to create a whole second system of education. And how they're doing that is to break down public schools. They call them failing. They've implemented all these testing mandates and all these things that public schools can't keep up with, at the same time that they starve the funding. So there's no money to do anything that they really need to do with. So they have the public schools fail, and then they say, oh, see, these public schools are failing. We need these special, shiny, wonderful charters to pick up the slack. And it's a nationwide assault. Florida is by no means the only one. We are the state with the third most charter schools. But even still, charter schools only account for 10% of our students in Florida and the nation, and 90% are educated in the public schools. So what does that say when they're starving public schools? They're starving the education of 90% of the population who pays taxes to go to this system. In Martin County alone, we have 19,000 students and 1,200 teachers. There's a new charter now that's starting. It's called Treasure Coast Classical Academy. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And they are going to have about 500 students to 1,000, about 30 to 50 teachers. Like, that's a big discrepancy when they're getting so much more of the pie for so many less students. So who are we really serving there? So what are charter schools? This is a really important differentiation. Basically, a charter school uses tax dollars to fund new schools. Most of them are private. Initially, they started out where they were supposed to be like learning labs of innovation. So if there was like something missing from a public school for a student in need or students in need, they could kind of start these programs and try to supplement, but then they were supposed to share that information with the public schools and kind of just have it be part of it.